In this video, I want to talk about the relationship between scenes, game objects, and components. And it's a bit of an oversimplification, but essentially you can get away with understanding the Unity landscape as being entirely composed of only those three types of things. So we can think that everything in our Unity game is either a scene, a game object, or a component. So we talked about scenes. Scenes are like the levels in our game. Uh, we're going to have several scenes if we're having a larger game. And if I double click a scene, it'll open in the scene view here in the scene editor. And so I'll just save this scene that I have, and this is the same thing that I was using to demonstrate the Unity interface. But the scene itself, everything inside of it is listed in the hierarchy view here in the left. And everything in it is a game object. The only things that can go in scenes are game objects. And if I were to click on any of these game objects, you'll notice that information about them shows up in the inspector. And in the inspector here is where we can check out all of the various components on the game object that define what it is. So each little section here in the inspector is a component, and you can notice everywhere there's a collapse arrow, that's essentially a new component. So there, like, that's not true here, but if it has like a bold name and then like a little section for it, it's a component. So I have a transform component, a cube mesh filter, a mesh renderer, and a box collider. These are the components making up our cube. And I can expand these again to see more about what all of the properties that are making up these components are. And so again, just fundamentally, we have to understand that Unity project is made up of scenes, and scenes are made up of game objects, and game objects are made up of components. And if I were to say right click in the hierarchy area here and choose create empty, this can make a empty generic game object. So it just says game object here, and you can't see it. It has no model or anything, because a model would be a component that this game object doesn't have. So if I select it in the hierarchy, I can highlight it and select it and move it. So it has positional information. So that's all stored on something known as a transform component. And transform is the only component that every game object has. So if you look at all these game objects, the one thing they all have in common, like cube, empty game object here, cube here, directional light, and main camera, they all have a transform. That is the only commonality that we are assured of that every game object is going to have. So every game object has a transform. And the transform is just how you keep track of its position and its rotation and its scale. Now, if I wanted to keep turning this empty game object into something more interesting than just a point in space, I can click the Add Component button and browse through all the various types of components that are built into Unity. So, for example, if I wanted this to play sound, I could click on audio and I could choose audio source, and then this is where I could plug in an MP3 file or a WAV file, and this formerly empty game object is now an audio player. So all the game objects start off generic, and you turn them into something by adding components. If I go back and look at one of our cubes, so I'll just click it in the scene view, or you could select it in the hierarchy, you can see again each of the cube components, or at least most of them, they have little check boxes next to them. And so if I were to uncheck one, like the easy to notice one would be the mesh renderer. The renderer is what's drawing the game object, so it's what's giving it its visual appearance. If I were to uncheck it, it disables that component, and now all of a sudden you can't see the box anymore, the cube. And if I were to uncheck its collider, this green outline here is a collider in Unity. If I uncheck that, well, you can still kind of see it, but it's more faint at least. If I turn it back on, it's bright. So that is now, this cube now no longer can be seen, and you can't bump into it anymore because I've turned off its collider. So I've really undone what's fundamentally making it a cube. And if I want to restore it as a cube, I can bit by bit re-enable these pieces of functionality. And one last thing to note, if I actually uncheck the entire game object at the top here, I can basically disable the whole game object. And that's called deactivating it. So I've set it's no longer active. And inactive objects in my hierarchy, you can see, are grayed out. So this cube is active, its name is listed in black, but this cube right here has been deactivated and it's listed in this gray font. And so that's how you can tell that a game object is deactivated. And this a game object that's deactivated is basically it's still present in the scene, but it's not doing anything. It's essentially like it's not there. You could turn it back on real easily, but as long as it's deactivated, you can walk right through it. It has no impact on anything in the scene. It's totally disabled. Alright, well that's all I really wanted to get across in this video. It's just this relationship between scenes, game objects, and components. It's a really important thing to kind of start getting used to as we go on in Unity development.